Life in southeastern Pennsylvania's Butter Valley at the turn of the century was mostly about family, home, work, community, and church. It was home to Annie Clemmer Funk, born on April 12, 1874, to James and Susanna Funk, on a mill farm near the village of Bally, 40 miles north of Philadelphia. The crystal-clear water of a branch of the Perkiomen Creek drove the Clemmer Mill, taken over by son-in-law James Funk, Annie's father. In this little valley, Annie Funk heard a call, drawing her to a land far away and a destiny remembered around the world. The Funk farm lay just a few miles from Bally's Hereford Mennonite congregation, where Father James was a devout deacon. In this fellowship and in this valley, Annie's childhood faith and response to Christ's call were formed. William Penn's promise of a land where all could live peaceably together brought persecution-weary Mennonites from Europe to America. Settling north of Philadelphia as quiet German-speaking farmers without higher education, they lived largely isolated from wider cultural influences. But in the 1840s, Minister John H. Oberholzer of nearby Upper Milford spoke up for a release from the constraints of tradition and greater activity. Mennonites at Bally, divided by these issues, separated into two independent congregations, though they shared the old meeting house for 3 years. The new congregation, taking the name of Hereford Mennonite, built its own more modern-looking church, and, led by Annie Funk's great-uncle Christian Clemmer, joined a nationwide General Conference network of Mennonite churches, eager to embrace more education, Sunday schools, and mission work. A late 20th century pastor, Robert Gerhardt, could sense the progressive character of Annie Funk's congregation.
It was a church that began to use English rather early for our Mennonite churches in this community. They were instrumental in pioneering some of the early mission work among the Native American people in Oklahoma.
The Hereford Mennonites responded enthusiastically to their General Conference's emphasis on mission activity. In 1880, when Annie was 6, the conference began work among the Arapaho people in Oklahoma Territory. Hereford's ladies quickly organized their own mission society to sow in support of the new mission project. In spite of the new zeal, mission work among the Native Americans proved difficult. Young workers, eager to bring their hard-working rural ethos along with the gospel, perhaps couldn't understand the resistance of what were, to them, a heathen people. Mission workers came from the culture responsible for so much oppression. Trying to fit Native Americans into a Mennonite Christian world and form a viable church found little success. Still, there were lessons Annie Funk and her church could learn. Capable leaders at Hereford kept the congregation in touch with some of the most progressive thinking and activity of the wider church. Preacher Ephraim Huntsberger, moving to Wadsworth, Ohio, had helped to found a school to train leaders for the mission work he advocated. And it was the university-educated C.H.A. Vandersmissen who would baptize Annie at age 14.
When Annie was born, her great-uncle, Christian Clemmer, was still the pastor. Following his tenure, a German pastor came, Carl C.H. Vandersmissen. He came with some new ideas as to young people's work, Sunday school work, mission work, and he would have been the pastor during Annie's childhood.
Annie's father, Deacon James B. Funk, was an enthusiastic supporter of one of Vandersmissen's new ideas for young people, introducing Christian endeavor at Hereford.
Annie would have been one of the charter members. And part of the work of Christian Endeavor was to give hands-on experience in leading meetings, in conducting meetings, in doing Bible studies, learning to pray in public, with an encouragement for Christian service and openness to serving in missions if the Lord would lead them in that way.
Encouraging young people in such organized, active church work was typical of the innovations Pastor Vandersmissen introduced, along with the first regular English language preaching. He was replaced in 1890, when Annie was 16, by likewise learned Anthony S. Shelley.
Anthony was very mission-minded, an outstanding organizer, very efficient administrator. I believe Anthony Shelley probably had a great impact on Annie's formative years.
Pastor Shelley, a leader also in the wider General Conference, most likely encouraged Annie to pursue post-high school education in preparation for Christian service. After studying at the normal school at Westchester, where elementary school teachers were trained, Annie enrolled at the Northfield Seminary for Ladies in Massachusetts.
That was operated by Dwight L. Moody, the well-known evangelist. Her training there would have probably been very general in terms of preparing her for whatever she will have to face, a bit of medicine, hand skills for supporting herself, being able to do some construction, as well as in-depth Bible courses in music.
Meanwhile, mission sentiment was growing. An old Mennonite minister, George Lambert, who had traveled around the globe in 1894, published a dramatic travelogue, stirring the hearts of readers feeling a passion for mission work. At Hereford, a new auditorium was added to host the 1899 General Conference session, where delegates agreed to begin mission work in India, forming a commission to send immediate emergency relief, and founding a mission program. When India suffered a severe famine in 1896 and 7, George Lambert had again traveled there to distribute supplies for an old Mennonite relief committee. His second book, India, the Horror-Stricken Empire, with many photographs and horrific stories of famine, must have been on the hearts of the conference delegates who met at Annie Funk's home church and called for a response. As one writer noted, the accounts of the heathen in India dying not only without food, but much worse, without Christ, fired the imagination of the church.
The little girl lying there suffers much and constantly. Her teeth are tightly clenched, and she keeps up an almost incessant low moan. Some days ago, a policeman found her lying in a jungle, thrown away, deserted by her parents, and left for the wild beasts, the vultures, and the crows.
With what urgency must these stories have been heard in 1899 by 25-year-old Annie Funk, home from the Northfield Seminary, feeling the call to mission work, serving where she could in her church's activities, waiting for a call. While waiting, she told a seatmate at a Christian Endeavor convention that she couldn't even sing. The mission board called 28-year-old Peter A. Penner and his 24-year-old wife Lizzie of Minnesota, as well as Russian-born John Kraker, a student at Bethel College in Kansas, and his new German-born bride Susanna. Speaking in local churches before departing, they sang, "Speed away, take the gospel of light to the lands that are wrapped in the darkness of night." The old Mennonites had already sent missionaries of their own to India. Their work was in the remote central province's town of Domtari, on the rail line between Bombay and Calcutta. The interior of this vast flat country, sometimes called Hindustan, had little accessibility by railroad or exposure to Western culture or mission work. To readers of church papers at home, this was dark and benighted India, a far distant land teeming with its millions of heathen. On arriving, the Krakers and Penners lived for 10 months as guests of the old Mennonites in Domtari, while looking for a field, if possible not too far distant. Trips in search of an area not already the field of another church's missionary effort led Peter Penner 150 miles northeast of Domtari to the villages of Champa and Janjgir. Here, among the lowest of the untouchable Chamar caste, they determined to begin their work. Back in Pennsylvania, Annie would read, "Think of the need and the work. 200,000 souls and only 4 missionaries." The Penners lived in a mud hut with a thatched roof as they began work with girls orphaned by the years of famine. 7 miles away in Janjgir, the Quakers had only a tent. Water came from a communal pool half a mile away. The missionaries had bungalows built to guard their health, and the developing compound with its temporary church could present a Christian contrast to the Hindus' caste, poverty, and ignorance. Tile roofs, high ceilings, and wide verandas protected from over 110-degree temperatures in the hot season. Yet fever, cholera, and malaria were constant threats. John Quaker suffered harshly from eczema. His wife Susanna, giving birth 5 times, nearly died. Lizzie Penner did die, as well as a daughter. Despite the immense preliminary work and serving all kinds of human needs, the workers held to their main purpose, bringing human souls to life in Christ.
The need is great. The people are steeped in gross idolatry. Woman is looked down upon, not the equal of man. Revolting heathen practices are in vogue.
At Champa, 2 lepers asking for food and begging to stay were joined by others hearing of this assistance and love. Unexpectedly, a leper hospital and ministry was begun, to which Peter A. Penner would give his life. Although the 2 growing compounds attracted many, few Indians could overcome the constraints of family, custom, and caste, and be drawn to Christ. Back home, aware of the need and her church's work in India, Annie waited, ready to go where a call might draw her. But there was no clear opening for her yet.
The opening first took place in Tennessee when she went to work among what at that time were called the colored people of Chattanooga, Tennessee. While she was there, she was working for the Methodist Church, and it would seem that she was involved in community development, in ministering to families in need in the colored community. Somehow she was then asked to come to Paterson, New Jersey, where she served again with the YWCA as a secretary, but with primary responsibility in inner city work.
In India, the young missionaries reported that there seemed to be little hunger for salvation. Finally, in 1906, after Lizzie Penner had died, they sent an urgent message. "We are not strong enough. 1 mission family, together with 1 unmarried woman, should be sent this year." Who would hear this call? In the Butter Valley, Annie Funk was listening. When the mission board, which included Annie's old pastor, C.H. Vandersmissen, immediately told Annie she was needed in India, she was convinced, as Pastor Shelley put it, that this call was God's answer to her years of quiet waiting. Knowing her family at home gave their blessing, Annie felt free to respond to a longing placed in her heart years before. She wrote to the mission board,
"Several years ago, I promised the Lord that if the way should open to go to the foreign field, I would do my duty. Now the door is open wide enough for me to do my duty to the extent of being willing to go."
On September 30, 1906, only 2 weeks after the appeal was published, Annie Funk was commissioned in the Hereford Mennonite Church to be a missionary to India. She was 32 years old. The mission board was protective of their precious appointee.
They did not feel it was prudent to send a single woman alone, and were looking for a colleague that could travel with her and be a co-worker on the field in India. A young woman from Halstead, Kansas, was available to serve in India, and the 2 were to travel together and to start their work in India. From what we can tell, illness prevented the other woman from being ready to sail in 1905, 1906. Annie then was given the opportunity to wait longer.
But Annie was ready and sailed out of New York on November 17th. Her 5-week voyage, crossing the Atlantic to London, went on through the Mediterranean to Port Said, Egypt, via the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. Another 1,300 miles south, past Aden at the tip of the Arabian Peninsula, brought her toward the western coast of India. Landing at Bombay, Annie found human scenes far worse than anything she had seen in Tennessee. An 800-mile train ride, probably followed by ox cart, brought her at Christmas to the village of Janjgir, a collection of thatched-roofed mud houses along narrow, twisting streets. Half a mile from the village was the Janjgir mission compound. By now, the Quakers had built themselves a larger home, and Annie moved into their original bungalow with its lime plaster floor. She quickly became attached to Susanna Quaker's fourth baby, Lily, whose siblings called the newcomer Aunt Annie. Peter Penner at Champa, after losing his wife, had been joined by Peter and Agnes Weens. For Annie and her fellow workers, ministering to the people of these remote villages required commitment and endurance. Most were of the Chamar caste, leather workers defiled by contact with dead animals. Almost all were desperately poor and, in the eyes of the missionaries, sinfully unambitious. Watching people live at the edge of survival was strange for Annie, as was the disease caused by contaminated water, poor food, and hygiene. Many babies died, and female infanticide was not unknown. Women were almost all illiterate, married as infants, and made brides as children. After 3 months, Annie wrote home,
The condition and practices of these people makes one's heart ache, and one longs to show them the better way. Some of the men seemed anxious for a girls' school, and we hope in the near future that one may be opened, and that the parents may long for their girls to become intelligent and to think for themselves.
The Hindu religion defined every part of the villagers' life and society. In it, the missionaries saw only pagan idolatry, reinforced by superstition.
They know no better, and what is worse, they care so little. The idols they worship represent such sinful characters that one does not wonder that these people live in such sin and are bound by such fetters which only the power of God can break. Pray that this needy people may see their great need and long for something better. Yours in the Master's service, Annie Funk.
To understand God's love, the missionaries believed these children needed education. But before she could work at that, Annie, along with the Weenses, had to struggle herself to learn a difficult language.
The characters of the Hindi language appear like a confused mixture, but by and by I can see more clearly. My present teacher is a Hindu gentleman, not a Christian. One cannot help but wonder how an intelligent person, having the two religions before him clearly, can cling to such emptiness. Many, I am sure, see it, but this awful, awful caste system keeps them from stepping out.
The firm hold of caste was completely at odds with the missionaries' message. Accepting Christ meant separation from family, the village, and any means of support. A few of the leper untouchables, already outside of the circle of society and dependent on the mission for life, would ask for baptism. Annie's letters home told of her struggle to know a people so foreign to her and her longing to bring the light of Christ to their darkness. Pastor Shelley introduced her to the larger church as a messenger of salvation to souls in heathen darkness. The Hereford congregation, reading reports in their quarterly record, supported this noble work in a far-off land, sending Annie money, a camera, dried fruits, and, at Easter, 101 cards. When Sunday school superintendent Dr. Oswin Berkey sent a medical book, Annie wrote back thankfully,
You ought to see some of the people who come here for medical help in times of sickness, and they wait until all their medicine fails, and they are nearly dead, but they expect an ordinary person to do wonders then. My thoughts often wander to the homeland. May the dear Lord keep us all close to himself.
Dreaming of a school for girls, Annie traveled to visit old Mennonite friends at Domtory, helped in Sunday school and evangelizing work, playing and singing with her little organ, and learned to find her way in this new world.
My mornings are taken up with study thus far. Even if one knows the words, to put them together properly is no easy task. I do go to the village, to one of the shut-in women, that is, the high-caste women, and teach her reading and sewing. But our school is not open as yet. You see, we have no orphanage, and so I have to find my work, which is not easy when you cannot speak properly.
After a year and a half in India, in a mud hut near Janjgir, a village school for girls was dedicated, and Annie began her work as a teacher. Her colleague Peter A. Penner would write admiringly,
"How well I remember that primitive school. A poor building, a mere handful of girls, and unqualified teachers. How well I remember the uphill work of that devoted Miss Funk. Eternity will reveal the results of this worthwhile endeavor."
Peter W. Penner and his wife Matilda came to Janjgir to replace the Quakers, since Father John's poor health was forcing them to leave India. They adopted Nellie, daughter of their Indian evangelist. To help at the school, the Penners had brought 23-year-old Anna Braun of Oregon. She moved with Annie into a new bungalow, giving them relief from the oppressive heat and insects of the dry and rainy seasons. Anna Braun's presence was more companionship for a lonely Annie. The two Annas traveled to the 4th World's Christian Endeavor Convention held in India. Enjoying the fellowship with other Christian missionaries, they also visited the Taj Mahal, which Annie described as simply exquisite. Both women enjoyed good health, and Annie rode to her school on a bicycle, presented her by young people at Quakertown and Philadelphia. But she wrote that the hot season takes all the energy and starch out of one. The missionaries thus usually spent some of that time in the hill country to the north, where Agnes Wiens and her children traveled in a typical Indian conveyance. But Annie asked to stay on the compound in 1910, as she at last could move her school from its mud hut to a substantial brick building. She wrote home,
"The money which you sent goes towards paying our teachers as well as school supplies. By this I mean books, slates, pencils, goods for sewing and the like. You may think this is all secular work, and so it is to a great extent, but by these means the people come to see that we are here to help them and not to hinder them. It is a drawing cord, and we trust that through it the children may be won to see the love of our Savior, and through them the parents. These things are bound to influence for good, even if we will never see the visible fruit of our labors."
Annie believed that the love which had drawn her to Christ would draw the people of Janjgir as well. 5 years in India had made Annie more at home there. But suddenly, word that her mother was seriously ill turned her thoughts back to the Butter Valley.
I am beginning to wonder how much longer it will be till I will be able to look into the faces of the loved ones at home. Since Mother is not so well, I cannot help but wonder what the next mail will bring. However, I try not to be anxious. Your sister in Christ, Annie Funk.
In response to her mother's illness, the mission board agreed to bring Annie home ahead of schedule for a year's furlough. Then, in March of 1912, while Annie was at a festival, a telegram from her pastor A.S. Shelley demanded, "Come home at once. Mother very ill. Have purchased passage on 2 ships." Within 2 days, Annie boarded a mail train for Bombay. Her parting words were, "Well, people, don't work too hard. Remember me while on the way." Sailing out of Bombay on the SS Persian, Annie had as cabin mate a Scottish woman her own age. Margaret Younger would remember Annie with great fondness.
"She was a dear, sweet-natured girl. In a short time we grew to love each other. We were very happy, and our journey passed off splendidly. Miss Funk had lots of curios and silk for dresses for her mother and sister, and she was sewing a pair of canvas slippers for her father."
Back at Hereford, the congregation postponed their spring communion service for 4 weeks, so that Annie could share it with them. Going ashore at Port Said for mail, Annie sent a letter to her sister Cora.
You can imagine that I am anxious to know why you have sent for me in such a hurry. I am compelled to go overland from Marseille to London in order to catch the Haverford. In 3 weeks' time, if the weather or strikes do not prevent, I hope to be in Butter Valley.
Rather than remaining on the Persian around Gibraltar, Annie took the train from Marseille and reached London by April 8th, 2 days before her second ship, the Haverford, was to sail. Disappointed to find a coal strike delaying her departure from London for 6 more days, Annie paid the extra fare for a second-class ticket on a huge new ship leaving in 2 days, the Titanic, Queen of the Ocean. The luxurious floating castle had been trumpeted as unsinkable. Carrying rich socialites as well as many poor immigrants, she left Southampton Harbor on April 10, 1912. There were stops for passengers in Cherbourg, France, and the next day at Queenstown, Ireland. There, Annie sent off a postcard to the Penners back in Janjgir, and another to her new Scottish friend, Margaret Younger. The next day, Friday, April 12th, out on the Atlantic, was Annie's 38th birthday. By Sunday, the Titanic was approaching the coast of Newfoundland, on schedule to arrive in New York by Wednesday. The course was meant to steer clear of icebergs, reported to be drifting farther south than usual, into the shipping lanes. Annie likely spent time enjoying the palatial ship and the cool, clear weather with other second-class passengers. On Sunday morning, there was a 10:30 worship service in the second-class dining room, and that evening at 8:30, about 100 passengers gathered for a hymn sing. If Annie was among them, she would likely have returned to her cabin for the night after 10 o'clock. At 20 minutes to midnight, a strange tremor passed through the ship, unnoticed by many asleep in their berths. An iceberg had ruptured the hull, and water was pouring into the lower decks. Sleeping passengers were roused by the crew and told to hurry on deck. Unable to believe that a ship designed and declared to be unsinkable could be in danger, many were at first reluctant to enter the lifeboats. There was only space enough for about 1,200 of the 2,200 people on board. In the confusion, some lifeboats left without being filled, while on others, too many tried to crowd on board. At 12:45, a crowd of passengers gathered for prayer, and around 2 a.m., a large group was heard singing hymns.
Growing up as a boy in this community, part of the oral history was this account that Annie Funk had been offered a seat in the lifeboat, saw a mother with a child still on deck, and insisted that the mother take that child and take her seat in the lifeboat.
At 2:18 a.m., April 15, the Titanic's stern rose from the water. A survivor, hanging on to an overturned canvas life raft, recalled the scene.
We could see groups of the almost 1,500 people aboard, clinging in clusters or bunches like swarming bees, only to fall as the great part of the ship, 250 feet of it, rose into the sky till it reached a 65 to 70 degree angle. Here it seemed to pause and just hung for what seemed like minutes. Then she slid quietly away from us into the sea.
By early morning, lifeboats filled with survivors were being pulled from the frigid water. Newspapers quickly carried confused reports of the number rescued. Most of the women and children were thought to be safe, keeping relatives in anguished suspense. The first passenger list released did not include the supplementary list of late ticket purchasers. As relatives crowded the White Star Line's office in New York, Annie's letter from London arrived in Butter Valley. Only when her name then appeared on the list of second-class passengers did the Funks realize what she must have done. Rescued passengers arrived in New York to be reunited with their families, but Annie was not among them. Could there be another Annie Funk? Annie's brothers traveled to New York, hoping for any information, but the local newspapers were printing their sad conclusion. On the following Sunday, the largest crowd in Hereford's history gathered with Annie's ailing mother for a memorial service. Annie's friends in New Jersey held services the same day. Leaders of the Eastern District Conference voted a week later to plan a memorial to Annie. From India, Peter Penner grieved that she is not to return and reported great lamentation among the women of Janjgir. Her story spread through the American Mennonite community. For the world, it was about the fabled Titanic. For Mennonites, especially her friends at Hereford, it was also about their devoted missionary.
Annie Funk was very much part of the memory of the community. People in this community, after the loss of her life, referred to her as our Annie. That term of endearment, I think, was very genuine and very deep. It wasn't just that she was from the community, but the community felt the loss of this vibrant personality.
The need to remember was felt by all the world. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, where the White Star Ship Line had an office, 209 of the 328 bodies recovered from the ocean were buried. In the chapel at Northfield, where Annie had studied, her name was placed on a plaque. In the graveyard of her church at Hereford, a crowd of 1,000, led by children singing "Work for the Night is Coming," dedicated a monument to Annie in 1913. Where it stands a century later, as time and the world flows by, who will pause to remember the Butter Valley's gift to India? In memory of Annie C. Funk, missionary in India, aged 38 years and 3 days. Her life was one of service in the spirit of the Master, not to be ministered unto, but to minister. Regathering in the Hereford Church, the choir sang a song of remembrance. In the land to which Annie had given herself, remembering took another form. Annie's dream of a girls' middle school and dormitory was fulfilled, in her name and memory. She had wanted it to be a drawing cord to Christ in the hearts of young Indian women.
Fading away like the stars of the morning, losing their light in the glorious sun.
Over the following half a century, some 3,500 girls attended, with Annie Funk's name on their lips and in their hearts. The Christian message was bringing life and happiness to the people Annie had loved.
Only remembered,
44 years after the Titanic sank, Indian Christians visited Bible school children in Souderton. Still later, as a popular film set attendance records, Souderton's Charlotte Strauss told Annie Funk's story in over 100 performances.
In Butter Valley or India, I must go.
only the truth that in life we have spoken. Only the seed that on earth we have sown. These shall pass onward when we are forgotten. Fruits of the harvest and what we have done.
Though she had physically faded from the scene of Butter Valley and Janjgir, a century later, Annie would be remembered for her faith and for what she had done.
Thus would we pass from this earth and its toiling, only remembered for what we have done.